Okay, so we're going to start. Now, this is the first and due to COVID-19, the only in real-time presentation and webinar for the conference. We started planning this 9th international workshop 2 years ago, and we made a booking for a 3-day conference at a wonderful venue in downtown Melbourne. And we were running along with booking, and Benjamin Sovacool, Professor Benjamin Sovacool from Sussex University in Britain, kindly agreed to be our invited international keynote speaker. And then on top of that, we invited 9 other keynote speakers. We have 2 prize winners of the International Network Awards, and we have received over 150 abstracts for this conference. So we want to welcome you. I'm Linda Hancock, this is Linda Wallachim. We've been the duo organising this and then jumping ship midstream and going online. But it's been great to have such support. We've had over 600 registrations for this webinar. And it's no doubt a reflection of the high-standing international reputation and calibre of our invited guest speaker. But before I get on to other things, I would like to do a formal welcome to country for this meeting and for other interfaces related online for this conference. I'd like to acknowledge the owners of the land that Linda and I are standing on and that the conference would have been conducted upon. It's the land of the Wurundjeri tribe of the Kulin Nation, and we want to pay our respects to the leaders past, present and emerging of our Indigenous people. Had we had the conference on land, we were planning a session down by the Yarra River with a formal smoke ceremony with some Indigenous leaders. But unfortunately, you'll have to wait for another conference in Melbourne to enjoy the rituals and the acknowledgements that come with that. It's a very moving ceremony. So the last conference, the 7th and 8th international workshops were held in Colombia, and last November, the 8th one in Sanya Island off China. And then, of course, this is the 9th, held virtually in Melbourne. So it's a great lineup. And the theme is sustainable, cleaner production, energy, water, food, nexus. And this is such an important theme that we are seeing around the world is not being forgotten with the health and the economic impact of COVID-19, because this is the time bomb. And so attached to this conference are 2 very important journals, the Journal of Cleaner Production with Chief Editor Cecilia Alameda from Brazil, and also the Executive Editor of the Journal of Environmental Management and Accounting, and that's Professor Feni Agostino. I've got a lot of people to thank, and the director of our institute, Professor Fethi Mansouri, who's also the UNESCO chair, the professor who's the chief investigator of the Centre for Excellence on Electromaterials Science, of which Linda and I are both members, and that is Professor Gordon Wallace, and Professor Biagio Gianetti, who's the founding director of the International Network of Cleaner Production. And I wanted to thank Luis Neto too, from Brazil, Sao Paulo and UNIP over there, for his superlative work uploading all the presentations. I do want to thank all those who made abstracts and the 13 who accepted our invitation to give a sample of these as presentations that are going to be uploaded on the web, and all those who registered for this webinar. I wanted to thank you for that. So I'll hand over to Linda now, Linda W. And she's going to talk about how the running for this evening is going to be handled.
Thank you. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Warm welcome to everyone. And thank you so much, Benjamin. We look forward to the keynote. Before we get started with that, I just wanted to point your attention to the chat function in the bottom. This is a recorded webinar. The recording will be made available, but you do have the option of chatting live in the chat function. And please do use the Q&A panel just in the bottom middle of the screen to record your questions. We will be moderating the questions at the end of the webinar, and you also have the option of voting for questions that are put forward in the Q&A window, which will allow us to select the questions that are of greatest interest to you all. So thank you for that, and we look forward to the keynote.
Okay, now it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Benjamin Sovacool, who's going to talk on conceptual frameworks and new frontiers in energy justice. I think there couldn't be a more important theme at the moment, and certainly his role as a lead author of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 6th assessment report, the AR6, which is coming out in 2022, is testimony to his standing in the policy aspects of this area. He's a prolific researcher. There have been jokes made about Benjamin that the reason why he likes long flights is because he can write another article or even book in the time, or certainly polish it up. But he's not only prolific, but incredibly important. And he's also chief editor of the Journal of Energy Research and Social Science, which is a leading journal in this area. So as director of the Sussex Energy Group, he plays an incredibly important role, both in the UK and Europe and also internationally. We have his bio on the website as well as in your invitation to this webinar. So I'd like to formally welcome you, Benjamin, and thank you very much, firstly for agreeing to undertake the long trip to come here, but secondly to get up early in the UK and give us this webinar at a time when people are working from home and many are facing increasing difficulties at this time. So as we focus on this very important topic, thank you very much for presenting. We'll hand it over to you.
You're very welcome, Linda, and thank you to both Lindas for doing an exceptional job organizing what was in effect 2 conferences, one that was supposed to be in person and then now this one that is online. So today I'm here to speak to you a bit about conceptual frameworks or frontiers in justice research, and I have to admit I have modified the presentation slightly to tap into some new empirical work that are doing. I really like this famous quote from a Supreme Court justice back in the United States who said, "A page of history is worth a volume of logic." And I really like applied research, practical research. I think there's a lot that we can learn from case studies. So I really want to illustrate some of the conceptual frameworks I'll talk about with some of the very recent field research we've done on this really important topic of justice. So to begin with, I thought it's always good, especially since many of you probably don't know what these words energy justice mean, to give you a very high level take. So we're going to kind of summarize not just my work, but work within the field across 10 years in the next 10 minutes. So consider this the high flying, very quick survey. My own work began on this at the Vermont Law School, where we ended up writing 3 books. And I think this book might win the ugliest cover award. But this book was the first of the 3 where we talked about all of the ways in which energy is linked to injustice, whether this is abuses of human rights with the extraction of energy fuels and services, not just fossil fuels, but things like wind turbines or even hydroelectric dams. the connections with energy and internal conflict, external conflict, violent conflict, war, and security issues. These pressing notions of energy poverty, lack of access to affordable energy in the developing world, or fuel poverty, unaffordable energy services for heat in places like the United Kingdom or even Australia and New Zealand. A whole laundry list of negative insults and threats that energy systems have to our ecosystems, biodiversity, and habitats. Things not just including climate change and air pollution, but land use, water, nuclear waste. The really pesky issues of policymaking and exclusion and the misrecognition of indigenous groups and other important stakeholders in energy planning processes. The second book moved a bit more philosophical, and this one was meant to kind of capture the really deep philosophical underpinnings of justice theory going way back thousands of years. So the first 4 concepts in this book really touch on classic philosophy, going all the way back to the Greeks, up to the utilitarians, to people like Immanuel Kant, and more recent notions of procedural justice. And then the bottom 4 are more recent notions of justice that have been advanced within the past century. So this is stuff going back into like the 1960s and 1970s. People like John Rawls, people like the libertarians and their notion of freedom, people like Edith Brown Rice and Ronald Dworkin talking about future generations and posterity, and very recent people in the past 30 years like Peter Singer or Henry Shue talking about kind of fairness and responsibility and our capacity to act to address things like climate change. And granted, we could have chosen kind of 8 different energy problems and looked at them through the lenses of 8 different justice concepts. So it would have been really complex. Instead, we chose one topic or problem and one concept just to illustrate how justice can matter in energy decision making. And then the final one we did, which was meant to be the most optimistic, was kind of case studies for energy justice, where we tried to look around the world at communities, companies, program managers, national planners, even civil rights movements that have made a difference at improving energy and justice issues around the world. And so this one has a series of case studies like Danish energy policy, or a program to fight fuel poverty in the UK, or the World Bank has an independent accountability mechanism known as the inspection panel. So if anyone listening has been harmed by the World Bank, you can actually file a complaint and it will be investigated potentially by the inspection panel. There's this thing called the EITI, which talks about information and transparency as a mechanism to fight corruption, especially the mismanagement of revenues coming from oil, gas, and mining. Sao Tome has a very progressive law that tries to save for future generations. We have a really neat international program for solar home systems in Bangladesh, which is promoting notions of equity. We have the Least Developed Countries Fund, funded by the GEF, which helped fund about $1 billion of voluntary adaptation efforts in the 66 least developed countries around the world. And then finally, we have Ecuador, and for a while, what was a really progressive notion about stranding their oil assets in exchange for investing in renewables and local knowledge and protection of indigenous peoples in rainforests. So drawing from all of that work, a book on problems, a book on principles, and a book on cases, we then kind of thought, well, what does energy justice mean now that we've grappled with all these different aspects and dimensions? And so this is the kind of simplified version. We think it involves 4 succinct bullet points. It is certainly about the costs or the hazards and insults, you know, and the kind of externalities of energy and how these are distributed fairly or not. But too much work focused solely on the costs. It's also about the benefits of energy and how ownership or access or investment or even the benefits of the energy services from these systems and technologies are distributed. So even a low-cost option like a cook stove may not be adequately distributed. Its benefits may only be limited to those of a higher income, higher caste, particular gender. We then think it's about procedures, ensuring that energy decision-making respects free, prior, informed consent. It is representative. There is adequate recourse if there have been harms. And then finally, we think that there's a special stream of justice thinking that talks about the vulnerable, recognizing those who may deserve not equal consideration, but special consideration because they're highly vulnerable or they've been previously marginalized, or maybe they have a history of being victimized by the state. Groups like the disabled, the homeless, indigenous people. So that means within all of this work, we've kind of advanced these two very different frameworks for energy justice. And I admit we probably should have named them differently. The first one, for lack of a better term, is the tenets approach. This one takes very different dimensions of justice: distributive justice, procedural justice, kind of cosmopolitan justice, which is about the universal respect for kind of humanity and human rights, or recognition justice. And you can apply them, as we have here in this paper, to different aspects of energy transition, in this case, electric vehicles. We also have this principled approach where we take 10 principles. And again, these principles are qualitative. We don't say that some are more or less important than others, but the idea here is that when you're making a decision about an energy technology or policy or program or innovation, you want to satisfy all of the principles. You want to make sure that it enhances people's ability to get affordable energy services in a transparent and accountable way that respects both intra and intergenerational equity and admits responsibility for our capacity to minimize harms and protect the environment. And you can already start to see, while you might be able to find a program or a technology that meets a few of those principles, it might be very, very hard to meet all of them, and they may often trade off with each other. That's the work that we have done on conceptual work, but of course, it's not just me or us or my team, and these pieces, for those of you that really are fascinated by energy justice, are certainly worth exploring at a later point. So we have the work of Kirsten and Darren, Raphael, Hannes, and Robert, which use a slightly different way of evaluating justice across evaluative terms and normative terms. So it kind of crosses that divide between description and evaluation and judgment. Here's just a selection of recent stuff that I've enjoyed reading, published within the past year. Noel and Jenny have some work that's very good on embodied energy injustices, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Duncan has applied energy justice thinking not to climate mitigation, but geoengineering, kind of solar radiation management and negative emissions technologies. And then my colleagues Raphael and Darren have started to talk more about the just transition and what it means as we decarbonize and maybe disrupt jobs and local tax revenue. And other local community assets that are dependent on carbon. There are also two special issues of energy justice that are quite exciting. I was loosely involved in both. The first one was in energy policy in 2018, edited by Darren, Kirsten, and Alistair, called Exploring the Energy Justice Nexus. This is excellent work. All of these papers have ended up being very highly cited, so it's really solid contributions to the energy justice field. And then we followed this through with another special issue that came out a year later in Applied Energy. And I apologize that Applied Energy hasn't updated their web HTML proofing, but it's not called Energy Justice. It's called Special Issue on Low Carbon Energy Systems and Energy Justice. It has another dozen contributions. These two special issues are quite nice because they have contributors from more than 30 countries. And they look at technologies, not just the usual ones like solar and wind and nuclear, but a whole variety of other systems and technologies and contexts that I think are really interesting. And then finally, when I was just getting started in my energy justice work, I found these two books very, very helpful. Gordon Walker has done excellent work on justice, and even though he calls this environmental justice, most of the case studies in the book relate to energy, waste to energy facilities, nuclear waste facilities, even some renewable energy. And the edited book by Karen, Gordon, and Harriet is one of the first edited volumes on justice, connecting it to climate change with lots of cases from around the world. So there you go. There's the energy justice field in 10 minutes. And hopefully I've planted seeds that you can explore later if you want to grow those thoughts into something more substantive. In the special issue for energy policy, the editors asked us to contribute a piece that tried to push the energy justice field into new frontiers. And this was a mix of fun, but also dangerous. It was fun because it was a chance for us to take stock of a field that we had been following over the past 10 years. But it was dangerous in that, you know, no one likes to be critiqued. And what we ended up doing in this article was even critiquing ourselves and some of the previous work that we had done. And even though this was published 3 years ago, I still think it captures in my mind 6 areas that I heartily welcome for those of you that are after addressing kind of pressing research gaps or picking up more marginalized research approaches. And the 6 frontiers were, first of all, non-Western theories of justice. If you go back to my slide with Michael Dworkin and the book for Cambridge, where we have this long list of justice thinkers, I go back to it, but I don't want to make you dizzy by going back in town Zoom. You'll notice that it is mostly a list of men. There are a few women. And it is mostly a list of Greco-Roman European scholars. So obviously, the lexicon of justice principles expands far beyond what a bunch of white people think or what a bunch of Europeans think. And so we think there's a lot of ability to draw on Chinese notions of justice, Asian notions, Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, Aboriginal peoples' notions of justice, whether it's from Australia or from maybe North America, or even South African notions of justice like Ubuntu. And so we talk about how those have equal appeal to all the Western concepts that we know and maybe are more familiar with. The second one is perhaps understandable, and that is most justice work, because we're concerned about making humanity more equitable and just, focuses on humans. And in fact, in the book covers that I showed you, other than the third one, which had a tree, the first 2 had people on them, right? People protesting, people impacted by energy. And so here we're kind of really pushing the community to say, well, there are lots of non-human centered notions of justice as well. It isn't just about us, right? It is also about the biosphere. It is also about maybe the rights of nature. It is also about what Peter Singer has called animal rights and animal liberation, non-sentient forms of life, sentient forms of life, keystone species, and other types of species. And so here we're kind of challenging the anthropocentric nature of justice. To how do we understand and better connect with those who aren't humans? The third area is also one that critiques our own work. In the case study book that I mentioned, The Tree, we have a whole lot of cases that are nation-centered, where we have Warm Front program in the UK, energy policy making in Denmark, solar home systems in Bangladesh, Yasuni ITT in Ecuador. But many of those issues aren't bounded within the nation state. They actually cut very much across countries, regions, and globes, especially given the global production networks involved with energy. And this is a really good example here would be Denmark. Although our chapter focused on the benefits of Denmark and its approach to promoting wind and combined heat and power and energy efficiency, Denmark is only able to do that because it's in Europe. It's connected to Nord Pool, so they're able to kind of filter hydroelectricity from Norway and also sell power down to Germany. And they're very integrated into European markets for technologies, goods, and services, strongly shaped by EU policy, and also have some very unique issues being a wealthy Nordic state. So if you unpack the Danish transition from a multi-scalar issue, it becomes a lot more complex. And maybe a lot of the success that we attributed Denmark doesn't necessarily hold true at other scales. The fourth area that we thought was really interesting, we've called the kind of business models or co-benefits of justice. Remember that first book I mentioned was all about the negative externalities of justice, of energy. This is about the positive externalities, the ways that doing things for justice also enhance health, community resilience, employment, energy security, help fight poverty, maybe promote gender equality. And in this kind of stream, we have a piece of work that talks about business models, 4 of business models that cooperatives and community interest companies have utilized to simultaneously meet justice principles and actually create revenue for shareholders or revenue for the companies involved. The fifth one is the political economy of justice, and this is how, sadly, those principles of energy justice that I mentioned don't exist in isolation. They do often trade off. And even things that we do in the name of justice, all of those 8 cases I talked about, they have losers. They have people who have something to lose, whether it is incumbent actors or whether it is perhaps a particular type of actor, like a wealthy consumer benefits at the expense of a poor consumer, or a man benefits at the expense of a woman. And so unfortunately, there's a political economy of justice where interventions aren't zero-sum. Interventions have a very complex set of people that benefit and people that don't. And then finally, because energy justice is so compelling, no one wants to be seen as unjust. You have a tendency for tyrants and unjust companies to use the discourse of energy justice even when they don't meet it. And so we have to be kind of danger of employing justice rhetorically in our own work, and very reflexive if we're doing research on it to make sure we're not reifying patterns of domination, hegemony, inequity, inequality, irresponsibility, and corruption, genocide, and violence. And so we really think there's a lot of scope to help better deconstruct the performance of energy justice as a discourse. So these were the 6 frontiers we came up with, and I have to tragically admit that my PowerPoint skills are very limited, so what you're about to see took me a long time to do. But what I want to talk about now is, look, the cross-scalar and whole systems issues one turned pink for a moment, and the political economy and winners and losers one turned pink for a moment. So I really want to show in the next part of the talk how just 2 of these frontiers, whole systems issues that extend beyond the nation state, and the notion of the political economy of justice and winners and losers, are really eye-opening and sobering and powerful in what they can reveal when applied to something as common as a low carbon transition here in Europe. And as a starting point for this, I had mentioned this a few minutes ago. This is the piece from Noel Healy, Jenny Stevens, and Stephanie Malin that talks about sacrifice zones for energy infrastructure. So there's a lot going on in this graph, but the 3 things I want to point out, firstly, is that energy systems have a life cycle, and that across that life cycle, from extraction to disposal, there are a whole host of different threats. From slow violence with minerals extraction, to uneven livelihood disruption in transport, to kind of amplified risks of toxics when we have disposal regimes and waste recycling. Second thing I want to point out, though, is most research that we do focuses on this square of the environmental impact assessment. Most work on solar focuses on solar and where it's going to be deployed, at a power plant or a home, or a wind farm, or a dam site. And even EIAs and social environmental impact assessments are designed to bound their assessment there at the point of use. And in doing so, unfortunately, they obscure a whole host of other ranges of impacts that are invisible, that are externalized, and that are naturalized because of that. The third thing I want to point out is that Noel's work has done a good job here mapping these externalities for coal. And he traces the genesis of coal across countries like Colombia, as well as all the way up to places like the United States. So a really nice multi-scalar analysis. But his work is only focused on fossil fuels. So what we wanted to ask in our research was, well, that is really interesting and problematic, but do these sacrifice zones also exist for non-fossil fuels? Do they exist for energy efficiency? Do they exist for wind and solar and other types of transitions that we think we want going forward to fight climate change? So we embarked on a 3-year research project to answer that question, funded by the Horizon 2020 program here in Europe. And we chose 4 very well-known case studies: nuclear power in France, solar energy in Germany, electric vehicles in Norway, and smart meters for electricity and gas here in Great Britain. And these cases, if you want to be unkind, have a mismatch of different times and technologies and countries. Or if you want a more favorable thing, we have strong heterogeneity in our cases, sampling different transitions at different points in time at different cultures with different technologies. So the idea is, if we can generalize, if we find common findings from cases as diverse as these, that might tell us something about the underlying justice aspects of low carbon transitions. We're a big fan of mixed methods work here at Sussex, and so we did use a 3-fold approach to collecting new data. We started with expert interviews in each of the 4 countries, and I'm still kind of surprised that people at many of these institutions even spoke to us, because we told them what we were after. We said, we're here to study the injustices of these possible transitions. So what was the CEA or EDF in France doing speaking to us? Or the German Energy Agency, right? Or the Ministry for Economic Affairs, or Smart Energy GB, who is the voice of the smart meter rollout here in the UK. So we had pretty exceptional access to experts involved in the transitions. We then did a series of public focus groups to get public views. And because the focus groups were meant to be in rural areas, we then tweaked them up with a final method of where we joined internet forums that had more than 2 million members and asked them our same questions. We used the same interview protocol across the expert interviews, the focus groups, and the internet forums. And as a result, cataloged all of the responses. And what's interesting is this just shows you, we tried to be a bit more rigorous. So for all of the quote injustices, we want to give a sense for how much it came up, and whether it was mentioned by one respondent who was maybe disgruntled by EDF, or whether it was mentioned by multiple respondents repeatedly. And we also break the injustices out according to the tenets approach that I mentioned before, where we have distributive, procedural, recognition, and cosmopolitan. So what this table shows you is only the distributive injustices related to the French nuclear program. And what we've done is we've ordered them in order of most frequent to least frequent, and we've given you a little tab here that tells you how much they came up, whether it was just in the research interviews, in the focus groups, or the internet forums. So something at the top here that is mentioned 11 times across all three sources, we would say has a high degree of triangulation. But there may be other injustices at the bottom mentioned once, one time, in one form of data that we say have less frequency. But still, despite this kind of rigorous approach, I was shocked by this. If you just add up the number of injustices, you still get 120 distinct ones on the list. So this is already quite sobering. 4 low carbon transitions in Europe get you, from our material, 120 distinct energy injustices. And here's where it gets even weirder. We always thought distributive injustices would dominate because it's really easy to talk about costs and benefits. But we really thought that maybe procedural issues would be next, because a lot of people talk about policymaking and planning and consent and NIMBY and all these other aspects, but it wasn't. In fact, recognitional issues came up the second, which is very troubling because it indicates that it's not just that low carbon systems harm, it's that they harm those who are most vulnerable. And finally, and this was also odd, just going by the pure list of injustices, smart meters had the most. They had more injustices than nuclear power, which I just find mind-boggling, followed by electric vehicles and solar photovoltaics. So we think that this kind of list does a nice job at revealing the kind of range of injustices and how they cut across all 4 technologies and 4 very different dimensions of justice. And in a related piece, we then kind of go a step further and say, what does this mean if you do take a whole systems multi-scalar approach, which is exactly what we had said needed to be done in our New Frontiers article. And here you can see a whole range of injustices appear across different spatial scales and across different temporal stages of an energy system. It isn't just about local use at the point of household or wind farm or biofuel plant, right? You have a whole other cascade, a matrix of injustices that transcend nations and even the globe, and also transcend the different life cycle components of different energy systems. And what's quite striking is if you add up from our material the injustices and you now recode them, not to be on their justice type, but on where they occur, our beloved 4 low carbon transitions have impacts that cascade in every continent around the world except for Antarctica. Australia is on this list because respondents talked about how the renewable energy transition being ushered in by Germany could completely disrupt both coal and LNG markets from Australia. China is here because of low-wage manufacturing and the exploitation of workers for solar PV. Russia is there because of reduced gas pipeline viability. The Congo is there because of cobalt mining. South America is there from lithium mining. The US is there because of disrupted coal mining. Canada is there because of disrupted tar sands. And I could go on, but you get the idea. So this reveals really the strength or weakness of a multi-scalar approach is that a given transition now becomes interconnected with 50 other countries around the world. And that's just based on our limited sample of a few expert interviews, focus groups, and internet forums. However, that list of injustices does nothing to tell you about the scale or scope or severity of the injustice. In some of our interview material, people talked about a traffic jam being an injustice. Others talked about child mining and the death of miners in the Congo. Those are 2 very different categorical injustices, death, murder, torture, versus inconvenience because of a traffic jam. So we embarked on a second phase of research where we really wanted to map the lived experiences of injustice, to talk about communities that we would think are the most vulnerable, or at least exceedingly vulnerable. And again, here we chose one case to visit. So for the French nuclear case, we actually visited French wineries. My research fellow was quite happy about that, but French wineries have been very much disrupted by nuclear power. For the German case, we visited the kind of bankrupt and defunct manufacturing centers of Eastern Germany, which have now collapsed because of the kind of Chinese innovation, and the learning and cost dynamics of solar have pushed the Germans out of the manufacturing market. For smart meters, we tracked the waste flows. So we ended up going to Ghana in sub-Saharan Africa, where there's a huge repository for electronic waste that handles 70% of e-waste in the UK. And then for EVs, we went to the Congo, where we spoke to artisanal and industrial cobalt miners. And again, we stuck with the same mixed methods approach, although the methods were different. We still wanted to do mixed methods. So we did expert interviews. You can see here our expert interviews in each of the 4 cases. We then did community interviews. So we talked to winemakers, mayors, ex-workers, union leaders. We talked to scrapyard workers, families, politicians. We talked to artisanal miners, mining groups, the police, crushers, carriers, reprocessors, safety inspectors, truck drivers. We even talked to 2 members of the mining police to get their view on how they think mining is a threat. And then we topped all that up with very intensive site visits. My research fellow, Bruno, got to visit 7 vineyards and 3 nuclear sites, so a bit of a mixed bag. And of course, 1 wine trade fair in Paris. My colleagues Andrea and Andrew went to 8 manufacturing sites in Germany, as well as 2 different affected communities. I led my team to Ghana, where we'd visited 20 scrapyards and different affiliated industries, as well as 3 trips to Ogbogblashie, which is the main centralized repository. And I also led a team to the Congo, where we did talk and visit 30 different mines and different parts of the cobalt supply chain process, from informal mines, formal mines, approved mines, discarded mines, as well as different processing centers and trading depots. So what did we find in this second phase of research using this kind of whole systems political economy framework? Well, we found perhaps what we expected to find, which is that many of the injustices are very stark. So here we have some quotes from our winemakers who just talk about how, there's been radioactive pollution in their water supply. Winemakers believed they'd be able to cohabitate very peacefully with nuclear energy, but in fact, many have seen up to a 40% loss of sales after incidents at nearby nuclear plants. These are wineries that have existed for hundreds to thousands of years and have existed making a product, right, where it is all about the land. And so when that land is polluted, you can definitely see both a direct loss of profitability and of course a huge loss of reputation. And I think I can tell you that, but I can also just show you, this is an actual photo of how close the vineyards get to the nuclear facilities. This is the Trisketon facility, which has had, I think, 3 different incidences of releases of radioactive materials into the environment. So you can imagine how, if you were to put this onto the wine bottle, my guess is that very few people would actually end up buying that bottle of wine. For solar workers, again, we went to Eastern Germany near the border of Poland, and this is another quote from our material. The real vulnerable group from the solar transition is ironically the German solar workers themselves. Everyone in Germany has been going, oh my goodness, we have to be careful of coal or nuclear. Yet most policymakers didn't bat an eye, didn't make a peep, as this quote says, about the shutdown of solar, where you've had about 108,000 people lose their jobs and about 12 companies and industries go bankrupt. Or there was a very succinct quote from one local mayor who said, Berlin got the electricity, we got the ashes. And again, if you visit these places, the field research is really revealing this is a multi-billion-dollar complex near Bitterfeld called Solar Park, which has been entirely abandoned. Right, so it is a huge amount of infrastructure that is just sitting there to be vandalized by graffiti artists, to be smashed and broken into by the homeless. So it's virtually impossible now to reconfigure it or to sell it up. To say nothing about how many of the businesses who have gone bankrupt have now become a burden on local municipalities because all of the lost tax revenue, litigation fees, remediation fees, and the cost of having to clean up a lot of this infrastructure that was just left behind and abandoned. So this case really reveals the tragic labor issues. How do we make solar energy cheap? Well, by creating pressures like this, which may actually end up sacrificing the workers and the unions behind how to make the low carbon products that we want. The third case I mentioned was scrapyard workers in Ghana. And here again, we went to Agboagbashi, which is a place near Accra. And this is quite a tragic quote. More than 100,000 people live here. You have young girls and boys engaged in the business. They drop out of school and basically collect waste. They go to look for scrap. This respondent knew a story of a young boy who ended up dying at the age of 12. Many see their life shortened by decades. They cough, they get infected, they fall sick. They dedicate their youth, their precious childhood, to working 20 hours a day, renting a wooden structure to sleep at night, close to the metal business. And many of them do this thinking they may send money for school, or many of this actually do this for their families, where they're repatriating money back to their parents or their brothers and sisters or their grandparents. And it's one thing to say that, it's another to see it. So this is from our field research. This is the burning of copper, or rather the burning of electronic devices to melt down the copper so you can easily pick it out. That black smoke is very carcinogenic. You can see here people going through the e-waste scrapyard to pick up kind of discarded pieces after the burning process. And if you have really good eyes, you'll see this kind of large object in the middle. That is a cow, and it is full of milk. And the people do drink the milk, and they will slaughter the cow. During our research, we also saw people walking around with chickens and other animals. So this is a very toxic environment that has direct connections to how people consume. And this is why, in fact, the community living around Agboagbashi has a life expectancy around 40 years, where the global average should be between 70 and 80 years. So it is literally killing them to be engaged in this business. Our final case was the Congo, where we connected it to electric vehicles, although it is also connected to other electronic devices like in-home displays, batteries, and even things like solar panels, because you need cobalt, copper for those. And again, another tragic quote, artisanal scale mining for cobalt is not living, it's dying. The moment you step inside the mine, the clock is ticking. You can get dust, you can get pneumonia, you can get mercury poisoning, you can drown, you can get crushed in a mine collapse. You can even get the plague because people are bringing in animals into the mine, and they're underground for 7 days at a time. Even if such things cannot kill you, they can still dismember or injure you. He knows of people who's lost their arms and legs, or that they've bled to death somewhere in the jungle. And this just kind of shows you, this is one cobalt miner who we photographed. If you can see, they don't even have shoes. They've left their flip-flops there. They don't even have a shovel. They don't even have proper structural supports or lighting. He just has one LED light on his forehead, and he also doesn't even have a ladder. And he is literally mining for cobalt in his hands, digging out of the earth to put into a sack, and then selling it at a local trading depot. It is an area where there are lots of children involved. So this shows you young children who are picking through mine tailings at one of the industrial sites. One of them is in his pajamas. All of them are bare feet. And this shows you another young boy who is about 7 years old, bringing a sack of cobalt to be traded at a trading depot. So the kind of connections with child labor and the kind of exploitation of children is very stark in the Congo. So what do we make of this, since I'm almost out of time? And I've probably thoroughly depressed you now. I think that this does have some positive and negative findings for us and how we think about transitions. I think the first one is tragically that these low carbon transitions in Europe are not net beneficial for all. They have real and growing losers who are subject to toxic pollution, exploited by unfair labor practices, the entrenchment of patriarchal gender relations, which I didn't talk about, but this is very strongly present in our cases in Ghana and the Congo, which has incredibly destructive and unjust implications for some. Whether you can see here, we've mapped out the kind of different environmental impacts with cobalt mining, and look at the multiple discharge points and as well as the multiple types of threats and how it happens at multiple parts of the cobalt life cycle. Or here is the one for e-waste, same sort of thing. This is a wicked multi-scalar issue that cuts across its own dimensions in space and time and pathways of environmental exposure. Interestingly, the injustices weren't just dominated by the evil centralized sources of energy like nuclear, right? We also see it with decentralized sources like solar, as well as even end-use devices like smart meters or electric vehicles or in-home displays or batteries or materials, some of which are ironically being used to help eradicate fuel poverty here in Europe. The procedural injustices remind us that it also isn't just about the technology. It is also about how the technology is governed, designed, planned for, and implemented in policy. So how it is governed is just as important of a problem as the technology. Whether it is critiques that the feed-in tariff in Germany have been exclusionary, because only people with homes or access to credit could usually participate in it, or whether it was the nature that the supplier-led rollout in the UK for smart meters meant that a lot of small-scale suppliers have been disadvantaged and gone bankrupt, or that there's unfair coverage in urban rural situations, or whether it is the French nuclear rollout, which is known for being very secretive about nuclear incidents and accidents on security grounds. Lots of those things at Trisketon that our winemakers were talking about are denied by the state, so it's very hard for them to get compensation. Or it's things like elitism in planning discussions. And here, remember, one of our 4 original cases was EVs in Norway, and we had a respondent tell us that the value of a single tax break for a Tesla owner in Oslo was the equivalent amount of 30,000 bus tickets. So there's an example of a kind of a subsidy that benefits one person owning a private vehicle, has the same value as one that could have helped 30,000 different people get in and out of the city center using mass transit. So it's a very elitist, auto-centric planning solution. Unfortunately, at the moment, given these inequality and unfair structures in place, the more that all of us in this community promote on decarbonization and clean tech and fintech and all these other things, the more we will put these groups at risk. The more we are successful at creating better policies and eliminating barriers and promoting social acceptance, the more we will enhance vulnerability within many of these groups. And what is also depressing is our work has only looked at 4 different communities. We looked at winemakers in France, manufacturing in Germany, and we looked at 2 ends of the supply chain for low carbon tech, cobalt and e-waste. And yet, I worry we will have the same sorts of justice risks amplified across all these other minerals as well. I didn't talk to you about the lithium politics, or the hafnium politics, or the rubber politics in Thailand, or the indium politics in China. So unfortunately, we have all these other materials and extractive components that we need in the supply chains. And I also haven't talked about the waste streams with all of these other minerals as well. And look at where they are around the world. So you take my map that mapped the 4 transitions and the 50 countries that are currently suffering. And it becomes probably every country on Earth is suffering in some way related to some of these components. And the cosmopolitan issues that we raise remind us that many of these injustices aren't just in Europe. Remember, our unit of analysis for this project was 4 European transitions: nuclear in France, solar in Germany, EVs in Norway, and smart meters here in Great Britain. And yet these are implicated in the kind of circulation of innovative designs, like French nuclear reactor designs being exported around the world, or the kind of trade of electricity. So the French nuclear rollout interfering with the ability for the Czech Republic to have a low carbon transition because they're dependent on cheap baseload from France, or issues of uranium mining in Niger or Kazakhstan, or even Australia or Canada, or issues of nuclear waste. These are all global issues. They don't just exist in Europe. Or we talk about this pressure for affordability, especially in the context of poverty, how we need low carbon systems to be affordable. Well, that puts incredible pressure on manufacturers to make low carbon technology as cheaply as possible, which then means you've shifted the problem now to unfair wage practices in places like China or Malaysia. Or the really pernicious issues of copper and cobalt and e-waste, which come out, and which I talked about earlier, or many of the kind of extractive industries that have to emerge behind the low carbon infrastructures that we think we want, or even where the cheaper, dirtier cars go when they leave places that we decarbonize. So in Norway, when EVs are taken up, where do you think the fossil fueled cars go? They don't just disappear. They end up going to places like Eastern Europe and even Africa, right? Because it's a cheap car. And so we have a situation where we're creating this kind of decarbonization divide of making one part of the world cleaner and less carbon intensive, but merely pushing the problem to peripheral areas of the global south. And this leads me to this really kind of troubling conclusion that, you know, the right to clean energy, it's one of the SDGs, may be a human right, but how we secure it currently faces trade-offs with other human rights. And it leads to two types of conflict that are very, very difficult. Green on green conflict, where environmental groups are pitted against each other, and poor on poor conflict, where fighting fuel poverty here in the UK depends on technology that exacerbates poverty in places of sub-Saharan Africa. And I'm really worried that kind of pure energy justice, or where we can maybe meet all those energy justice principles or tenets, may not be possible. It may only be about picking the losers and choosing the winners. There's no such thing as a loser-free approach to energy justice policymaking. And amid all of that, I think that we have to avoid kind of conceptual approaches or research designs, myself included, that obscure or mask these multi-scale or political economy issues. We don't need another environmental impact assessment of a wind farm in Australia that only focuses on its impacts to the community. We need to kind of better grapple with these very complicated global dynamics that threaten to cement this decarbonization divide at a critical turning point in civilization, where we also need to start mitigating and cutting carbon. And with that, Linda, I'm happy to stop talking and turn it back over to you. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Benjamin. That gives a lot of stimulus for discussion, and we've had a number of questions rolling in. I can't read them actually because they're a bit small, but just to start the ball rolling, your issue about having EVs coming on board and what happens to their cars. Could you say a bit about the hydrogen revolution or innovation, in the sense that in Australia, you know, we've got all this solar, and there has recently been a huge project set up to generate hydrogen and export it to Asia. Some of the use of hydrogen can be in the form of ammonium, and may entail or enable a transition for cars. So could you say a bit about the timing of transitions and how that may be an important dimension in terms of offsetting some of these inequalities that you've drawn very graphic attention to?
Oh, good question, Linda. We did think about hydrogen. So when we were choosing our 4 cases, what we wanted to do is choose kind of cases of transitions that had happened, right? In each of the 4 that we've chosen, except for the smart meters one, because the UK smart meter transition is about halfway through, and they just delayed it by 4 years to 2024. But we thought about choosing kind of exciting transitions in the future: small modular reactors, hydrogen, maybe next generation wind and solar, advanced biofuel. And we decided not to because it was way too speculative. And also we suspected that people wouldn't have even thought about injustices because it's very much about the imaginaries of those systems rather than kind of dealing with transitions that have actually empirically affected people. But I'm worried that even things like hydrogen probably would have the same sorts of justice implications that we showed in our work, especially related to EVs. And so I know hydrogen has a life cycle, has to come from somewhere. And it usually comes from natural gas, and it will probably require a whole lot of new infrastructure, especially pipelines and distribution centers. And there's a huge issue of timing as well. You know, I personally believe, I'm probably going to anger half of the conference, but I personally believe it might be too late for hydrogen and also SMRs, because if you read the kind of work from the IPCC and the 1.5 degree report, we've got like 5 years to decarbonize. Like, we've got to lock out emissions now. And a lot of these nascent technologies like hydrogen or others don't have the time. Like we had the time 15 years ago. So I'm worried that it's kind of too late to wait for a lot of these niches that are so far away. And the final thing that I can say is we did just have a piece at Energy Research and Social Science that talks about a research agenda for justice and hydrogen that tries to tease out, it's from a European perspective, but it tries to tease out many of the kind of trade-offs that will happen among justice aspects as we think about hydrogen, in terms of who owns the technology, who accesses it, its environmental impacts, how clean it is, how it creates new geopolitical dependencies and all of that. So I think that's a good starting point. It's not applicable in the Australian context, but I think that I would at least caution that I don't think it's a net justice win. I need to see the evidence on hydrogen, and I think it would depend on how that transition unfolds, how it's planned for, how it's governed, and how it's designed.
Yeah, good answer. Do you want to?
Sure. We have another question from one of the attendees, thanking you for your wonderful presentation, first of all. And the question is, the object of justice, if the object of justice changes between people, intergenerational people, society, country, energy companies, how will the solution then change if a different object of justice is chosen?
Very tricky question. One that justice thinkers have been grappling with for hundreds of years. And John Rawls himself tried to struggle with this in his Principles of Justice. And he took kind of whether your view is he took a cop-out view or he took a clever view is kind of debated. But his view was that justice should be whatever an informed community decides it should be. So each community should set its own justice principles. And who knows better, right? You, Lindas, know what's best, hopefully, for your community in ways that I don't. Just like I know things about my community that you don't know. So Rawls kind of thought that justice for him was creating a social contract among different people, and then everyone adheres to that contract. And that means that justice for me and my community is different than justice for you and your community. The object of justice is defined by a group of informed people who then agree to kind of operate on norms and rules. But the problem with that is it then means that different communities could choose based on their own interests very unjust regimes that marginalize indigenous people, that marginalize women, that marginalize low carbon technology, and that's within their right. And Rawls even famously said, you shouldn't impose liberal justice concepts on illiberal societies. So he's even saying, let's not do justice imperialism, where we take my notion of justice and force it on everyone. So that's the kind of stance for relativism in justice. We self-define our own justice goals. But the critique to that is cosmopolitanism. And that's also why we put cosmopolitanism into our framework alongside Rawls, because we're very worried about that ability for justice to kind of race to the bottom and be self-defined. And cosmopolitanism rejects that. It says that, no, there is a common element in that we are all humans. And as humans, we all have basic inalienable rights, and there is such a thing as right and wrong. And that means it is wrong for communities to adopt their own justice frameworks if they will lead to things like genocide, discrimination, patriarchy, violence, and all of that. So they would say, you're damn right, we should be applying liberal principles onto a liberal societies. That's the point. And that debate rages back and forth. And we kind of sidestep it by indicating that we think both distribution and cosmopolitan issues belong in a justice framework. But we're very careful not to weight them. We're very careful not to say that one is more important than the other. And we're also very careful with our principles not to say some supersede others. So I guess there's also a little bit of an element of relativism there, and that it will depend on how you weight those principles based on the particular research community or technology. So whether that's clever or a cop-out, I'm not sure. But at least it feeds into this central debate about universal justice versus very relativistic justice.
Thanks for that. There's a question here about life cycle, social life cycle assessment and injustice in the value chain of energy sources. Have you got some comments on that, or some examples of what could prevail in terms of fairness?
Well, it's tricky as well, because I mean, my research that I just presented in a way is critiquing the way that we conceive of most EIAs, saying they need to be bigger and broader and more multi-scalar and more incorporating. But at the same time, I can understand if it's some small-scale entrepreneur who's promoting a small wind turbine in Adelaide, do they really have the capacity to do some EIA that is looking at 180 countries, right? They don't have the money for that. They don't have the time for that. And in a world of climate emergency, don't we want that wind turbine deployed in 4 months? Whereas it would take them a year to do the study alone. So I realize there are tensions here in this desire to have a kind of whole systems multi-scalar approach all the time. But at the same time, I don't want there to be a million small-scale wind farms that have VIAs that don't address any of these issues. So I think what we're getting into here is it's a problem of different actors and different scales. In our research, we would really like to see intergovernmental groups, especially the International Renewable Energy Agency, the International Energy Agency, the OECD, the ILO is very good on labor issues. The UN is very good on human rights issues. Amnesty International is also very good on some of the issues of human rights abuses. It's at that scale, or it's at the scale of the supply chain. So it's the companies themselves who are having to buy 50 different mineral inputs across 7 or 8 different life cycle stages. Those two actors, intergovernmental organizations and corporations, seem the best positioned to address these issues because only they can see the whole supply chain, and they can exert pressure on parts of that supply chain from siting to disposal to waste and all of that. So I think this is a tricky situation where responsibility should lie mostly with them because they're probably the only ones who have both the power and the data to deal with it. And I wouldn't necessarily expect all these small scale EIAs or SEIAs to change. At the same time, you know, for some of these larger scale projects, these mega projects, the ones that would be very substantial, you know, gigawatt scale wind farms, huge CSP facilities like Desert Tech or Gobi Tech, I think those would have the capacity to do better EIAs that are more global simply because of their scale and their resources. So maybe there's a threshold effect here of where projects above a certain size have to do this sort of work. Otherwise, for projects of a smaller size, it's actors like IGOs and corporations.
Do you want to ask me?
Yeah, we did have a few questions that were emailed to us in advance. So I'm just trying to
Okay.
locate them.
How did they know the questions to ask before I even presented?
They all read your excellent article, I guess. So it was one that was focused on policies, really. So how do policies best address those cross-scalar issues of justice?
Great question. And here I have an answer. So I should caveat this with 2 things. So in our research methodology for the projects, we did ask these really difficult questions like, tell me the injustices with the transition. Tell me who's most vulnerable. Tell me where the impacts happen beyond Europe. But we also asked 2 other questions. To get them warmed up, we asked them about the benefits of the transitions. And we have a whole paper that came out first on the qualitative co-benefits of the 4 transitions. And I'm really happy to say there are more co-benefits than injustices. So we have 128 benefits and 120 injustices. So the benefits outweigh them by 8 if you're just using the laundry list approach. So that at least puts this into context, because the whole injustice work could be used by people who are advocating against low carbon transitions. We didn't want that. So there's still a whole compelling array of things that these transitions bring that are positive across different dimensions: social, political, economic, environmental. The other question we asked at the end was on policy. So we did actually ask our respondents at the end of the interview, what policy changes need implemented to make these transitions more just? And we got some good responses. We got like 50 different policy suggestions. And what we've done in the article on the decarbonization divide is we've listed them and how much they come up in the interview material. And they are multi-scalar. So some of them are dealing with waste, some of them are dealing with minerals and metals, some of them are dealing with manufacturing, and some of them are dealing with kind of diffusion and use. So already you can start to see the problem. What policymaker has control over those? None. You're dealing with 4 separate ranges of policymakers. However, most of the policy options made a lot of sense to us and in our mind would be effective. So this at least implies if you want a blueprint out of these injustices, we know what to do. We can think of what to do, and there's a whole list of things our experts say that needs done. What's lacking is the political will to do it, or what's lacking is the ability to pay more for low carbon systems if we are to be more responsible with their sourcing, better design systems that handle waste streams and all of that. So I think that's the pickle. You've got to implement policy changes at multiple scales, and you have to potentially make low carbon energy more expensive if it's going to be more just.
There's a question we got about us entering an era where the nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement are starting to frame national goals and also access finance, for example, from the Global Green Fund, and that this is seen as a way of trying to accelerate the transitions for less developed countries. So do you have any comments about how one can build in, or whether there are adequate built-in safeguards that you know are on the rise here, to try to put in some policies and, I guess, frameworks to give greater reassurance that the sorts of transitional plans being developed there, many are calling on consultants and international agencies to help them. And also there's the whole spectre of partnerships and the way they can vary, especially PPPs. So what do you see as the kind of forward-thinking landscape in terms of how countries may frame this, use available money, and also accelerate decarbonisation that's just and fair?
Yeah. My sons are here, by the way.
Hi.
Hi, Zachary. I know I get to type messages, so I guess I should make this quick. Yeah, I'm a fan of, first of all, Eleanor Ostrom's work that talked about polycentrism and talked about acting at the top down and the bottom up simultaneously. And I think that has a lot of value. They love computers. And I think that would mean that we have policies that we implement at the community level, policy levels that we operate at the top down in the middle. However, there are also things that came up in our material. Bye, guys. That would make a lot of impact. And so two mechanisms that came out were community benefit agreements.
Daddy, this is so boring.
Where you can have, Zachary, Ethan, where you share the benefits of energy projects directly with communities. And then the other one is free prior informed consent, FPIC, where you would make sure that people are adequately represented. But those are just kind of two ideas that came off the top of my head. And maybe I should go now, Linda. What do you think?
I think we should probably let you go. It's early in the morning. And are the kids back at school in the UK yet?
They are, although as you can see, it's homeschool, and they're on a break right now.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I used to wonder how I'd live through curriculum days, let alone having homeschool. So, look, that's been great, Benjamin, and thank you very much for getting up early and for your wonderful presentation. You know, you've really given out some great ideas there, and also introduced people to a whole range of fantastic research, and certainly we'll look forward to seeing more of that reported from what you talked about as the New Horizon 2020. So thank you very much, big thank you, and thank you, boys, for allowing your father to participate. And yeah,
You're very welcome, Linda. You're very welcome.
And we'll
have a
look
great
forward to
conference.
when we do meet up face-to-face again. Thank you very much again. And thank you all of those who've been listening in and sending messages. I'm sure that some of the questions that have remained unanswered, you'll get some ideas from reading some more of this research. And thank you to those who've participated. So thanks all round.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.